The eventual development of the Cooperative Extension Service was aided by two earlier key pieces of legislation, the Morrill and Hatch Acts. As we've noted, in the early 1800s and throughout the 1800s, agriculture was the nation's central pursuit. And because it was so important as an economic engine for the country, and so many people were engaged in this area, many started to recognize that we needed a different type of college to educate these people. Before this, having any sort of college education was reserved to only the most wealthy, the people who could afford to pay their own boarding at a school that maybe wasn't right, at home, near their homes. And so these attempts to open these agriculture schools during this time frame suffered because they couldn't recruit the best teachers. They struggled to develop the right curriculum. And then it was just a financial burden for many people who were involved in this. So in 1857, Justin Smith Morrill of Vermont first introduced this bill. And it was vetoed, but eventually signed into law by President Lincoln. In this period of time, 1862, as we were facing the Civil War, many people recognized that we needed to support these agricultural schools that often had some sort of military arts. So it was a strategic effort to also enhance the Union's military standing. So what this Morrill Act did was it donated federal land to each state and territory. And then each state or territory could sell that land to fund a university, to fund a college that focused on agriculture and the mechanic arts. This is a precursor to engineering. And again, during this time frame, the United States was cash poor but land rich. And so this was a really ingenious way to sell this land that we had in abundance in order to fund the war efforts. But it also established these universities in every state that could focus on these topics. So he said that these land-grant colleges are deeply rooted in the American democratic ideal, that opportunities should be available to everyone, and that education is the vehicle for that opportunity. So it was part of our United States kind of national pride that we could provide this source of public education to everyone where they are, even Alaska. So I found an interesting article that really, to me, highlighted the impact that this act and the subsequent actions had for the U.S. And this is a very long article, so I'm going to just show a couple points from it. But what the authors here are proposing is that the U.S.'s ascent into an economic superpower is because of this act and its ability to leverage the human capital. So these two figures show the United Kingdom and the United States as a comparison of gross domestic product and then per capita income, I believe. And you can see that the US here is below the United Kingdom, and then here is where that act was passed, and we start to see some differentiation. And then we have the Great Depression in here. Same on this one. So right here is where that law was passed, and then we see some gradual increases and differentiation. So the authors concluded that the establishment of the land-grant university system in the United States was an important factor for why we became an economic superpower. And I realize this is a lot of text, but I just wanted to highlight that they did all kinds of economic statistical measures, and to me it's really encouraging that this emphasis on providing education to all led to this incredible increase in the United States economic engine. So over time, the Morrill Act has been amended. So we have the original 1862 universities. We also have 1890 universities. And these are states where if they had used those original funds to open schools only for white students, they either had to then allow Black students to attend those schools or establish a separate 1890 institution. And there's actually an 1890 Universities Foundation, and you can read a lot more about that development. In 1994, there was another amendment to provide funding to universities that had focused or do focus on Native American tribally controlled colleges and grant them land grant status so that they are eligible for federal funding and all the benefits that the other universities have. So this is a map. I'm not going to leave it up in the video very long, but it does highlight all of the 1862, the 1890, and then 1994 universities. So I hope that you can identify your state or maybe another state of interest on here to identify what are those land grant universities and colleges. And as you'll see here in Texas, we only have the 1862 and then 1890 universities. And my home state of Kansas doesn't have the 1890 university, but it does have a 1994 university. So along with the Morrill Act, there is the Hatch Act. So again, neither the Morrill Act or the Hatch Act established the Extension Service. These are precursors. But what the Hatch Act did was establish agricultural experiment stations. So this was an effort that every state would have an experiment station, often connected with the university. And in many states, they're located in several areas of the state. And these started to have direct application of science to the problems of agriculture. And farmers really wanted to know what the best practices were, how they could be most profitable, how they could control diseases, how they should be feeding livestock, growing crops, what crops were the best to grow, and so on. So the forefather of American extension is Seaman Knapp. And he argued that every state needed this station united with the agricultural college. So this Hatch Act is named after William Henry Hatch. He was a congressman from Missouri, and he introduced the legislation to provide funding. And these stations were required to provide bulletins or reports of the projects. So here's an example of one from 1929. So I mentioned Seaman Knapp, and we're going to get to him in just a little bit. But I want to talk about some other inspiration for extension education. So from the Civil War to the 1920s, there were two interesting movements that were happening in the United States: lyceums and chautauquas. So lyceum was a type of secondary school where people gathered to hear lectures. So this is a picture of one. And they were kind of like the modern, during that time, they were like our TEDx talks today, where anybody could propose to stand up here on the podium and provide a lecture about a topic. And so people from all over came to sit and listen to these educational lectures. And remember, this is before, television and radio. So this was the best way for them to gather to learn more about a topic if they weren't in a university setting. Then we have chautauquas. These seem more like camps. And the chautauquas were often in tents in certain locations, and they would bring in speakers and they would have music, and people would stay for a week at these locations. and hear, a lot of different perspectives. And this is, you can see from Waxahachie, both of these here in Texas. So they were very popular, and they started to fade a bit in the 1920s. Of course, the Great Depression came along, but they were two early movements that really focused on non-formal adult education. There were also farmers' institutes. These were the first efforts to extend boundaries of the university campus. So by 1899, all but 3 states had regular farmers' institutes, and there were different courses offered for men and women. These farmers' institutes can also be found through Tuskegee Institute. And I'm not going to do this justice. We could have a whole lecture just on the role and the influence of Tuskegee Institute in agricultural education and extension education. But Booker T. Washington was at the Tuskegee Institute, and he began extension efforts for rural Black families. So for people who were living in very rural areas, often very poor areas, and providing them with education that would help improve their daily life. And he organized one of these farmers' institutes in 1890. One of Booker T. Washington's colleagues was George Washington Carver. And again, he was such a foundational character in this idea of extension education that the National Agriculture Library has an exhibit about him. So I've included the full URL here in case you want to try to track that down and take a look. But George Washington Carver worked there at Tuskegee for 47 years and did an incredible amount of work with what types of vegetables and techniques would be most beneficial for people in the South, and was well known for his work with peanuts and sweet potatoes. He developed something called the Jessup wagon, and this contained machinery, seeds, equipment, and materials, and they would take this Jessup wagon and move it from place to place so people could have a chance to learn the latest techniques or see the latest agricultural technology. And here's another picture of one of these demonstrations. Another type of movable school was a railroad train. So again, all of this is happening before we have a formal extension service. But these railroad trains would travel, as you can imagine, across the tracks and stopping in different areas. And they would have educational lectures and demonstrations. So these are, college lecturers who are going on a road show and demonstrating what they're learning to help the farmers that would gather for these types of educational opportunities. These movable schools started to impact the faculty who were working in agriculture. The faculty roles started to change. So many of these agricultural lecturers worked in experiment stations that were connected to the ag schools in the area. They taught classes, they traveled and conducted demonstrations, they wrote bulletins, reports, and articles, and they attended farmers' meetings. So rather than being constrained to that classroom environment and just telling the few who could come to that, they were taking that knowledge out to the community and extending it from the university setting. So in the next video, I'm going to pick up with Seaman Knapp because I want to make sure that we can spend a little more time on who he was and his influence on extension.